Alright, 10th graders, today we're starting kind of a new section of period 5. We just finished talking about the Enlightenment and its effects on the world, particularly through the Atlantic revolutions and the creation of nationalism. Now we're going to go to the next big touch point in history, the Industrial Revolution. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, we live as we live today, with machines, technology, with us living in cities as well. All of that comes from this revolution. So today we're going to talk about what was it like before the Industrial Revolution and what caused the Industrial Revolution. Then the rest of this week we're going to be focusing on effects of the Industrial Revolution. Cool, with that in mind, let's get to our important definitions. We have two important definitions. Our first definition is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution basically is the use of machines to produce things. So instead of producing things or making things by hand, you now use machines and the development of all these new pieces of technology that do this. Our second important word is production. Production is the creation of goods. In economics, there's this huge, and like the whole point of economics is how much you can produce of something, how quickly and how cheaply. It's the whole goal. You want to produce many things cheaply, well made, so that you can sell those things for a profit. Cool, so first, the context of the world. If you were to look at the world starting at period 5, and you had to pick which area is most likely to industrialize, you probably wouldn't say Europe. The Ottoman Empire, which in the 1600s was a very powerful empire that controlled trade, that had a pretty strong manufacturing production section, area that you would assume could potentially industrialize. You had India, which produced a lot of cheap clothes and was one of the largest producers of goods, particularly clothes, in the world. And you had China, which was considered the wealthiest, most powerful empire. So why Europe? Well, that's what we kind of want to look at. Like, why is it that Europe, out of all these areas, is the one that discovers and starts using these technologies and makes these huge changes? So before we do that, we need to talk about the context of Europe, or Europe before the Industrial Revolution. First, everything is just slow. We're used to a pretty fast life. Cars, trains, automobiles, things like, I said cars twice basically. Phones, like we can figure out things instantly. We can get places quickly. Before the Industrial Revolution, life is just slow. You can get anywhere as fast as you can walk or you ride a horse. Everything is human or animal powered, or you can travel by boat. But basically the idea being is that it takes a long time to do anything. Not only that, life is rural. Anywhere from 80 to 90% of Europe's population did not live in cities, which is where we consider the most production, the most innovation to happen. So almost everyone lives in rural towns or villages and is most likely a farmer of some sort. Not only that, our production. Production is slow. Everything is handmade. And even then, you can only work by the sunlight or you can work in nice weather. So there's a lot of things that prevent you from producing at a high level. We also have this thing called the guild system. The guild system, this was formed in many areas around the world. This guild system is basically where a whole bunch of people who create one item get together and write a bunch of rules about how to create that item, what price that item be sold at. The idea being is that if you can create a monopoly, you can make a lot of money because you're the only group people can go to buy that good. And so what guilds did is that it made a lot of money for people in the guild, but it stifled innovation. As if I wanted to be a carpenter, but I couldn't get into the carpenter's guild, I literally wasn't allowed to be a carpenter. So that prevented a lot of people who could have innovated or improved items. So looking at Europe, you're like, well, okay, well, then why is Europe going to be the one that industrializes? Before we answer that question, we're going to pause here and you're going to answer your first question. Go ahead and go. Okay, moving on to why did Europe industrialize first? So Europe has a bunch of key ideas or advantages that is going to cause them to be the first to industrialize. So let's look. First, we have the idea of competition. We've talked about this a lot when it comes to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. But the basic idea is that there are many, many European countries that are constantly competing with each other. And that competition pushes each country to innovate and to try new things. That's how you get new technologies. That's how you get new techniques. And that also allows people to try new methods of production, which is going to push this industrial revolution forward. Competition is going to come up in a couple of these other reasons as well. Next is rulers and merchants. We could also say rulers, merchants, and businessmen. So on this idea of competition, many of these European countries were constantly at war. They're competing both in technology but also in war. War costs a lot of money. And so what happens is that this causes European rulers to be a lot more lenient with businessmen and merchants. What I mean by this is that throughout most of human history, empires tended to have a lot of rules on what they could trade, how they could trade it. Sometimes the government itself traded certain goods. So in this case, the rulers basically allowed merchants and businessmen to have a lot more freedom to do what they wanted. That means merchants and businessmen could decide the rules of their workers, could decide where and how they trade things, could decide how to work together to trade stuff, could try new goods and new methods of creating goods. All this to say is that rulers who wanted to make tax wealth and get loans from merchants and businessmen allowed them to have a lot more freedom. This freedom is going to allow more innovation and more change and more potential to take on these techniques that are going to cause the Industrial Revolution to happen. Finally, Europe also had a lot of capital. That means wealth. Specifically, there are a lot of investors or rich people, investors and banks who have money and are willing to invest to help build these factories and buy these machines. Machines and factories are very expensive up front. They will make you a lot of money over time, but up front, very few people could just buy and build a factory. So Europe had the advantage of having a lot of rich merchants and having a lot of banks who had the freedom and the want to invest in factories and let these try and see if they would work, and they did. Next is European exploration. European exploration is both going to cause innovation and cause competition. So first, European countries have explored all over the world by period 5. Many of them have established colonies in the Americas, some minor areas of trade in Africa, and also trade in Asia. Now what these colonies do is that, as we talked about with the mercantilist system, these colonies both produce cheap raw resources that could be used in factories, specifically cotton, sugar, and tobacco. Cotton being used to make clothes. So raw resources that could be used in factories to make finished goods. Not only that, these colonies were places that Europe could then go sell their finished goods. So there was a guaranteed market or place that people could buy goods. European exploration, though, also created more competition. European explorers, as Europeans began to trade in the Indian Ocean trade, they brought back two types of goods. First, they brought back a lot of cheap, well-made Indian textiles or clothes. And as these textiles flooded the markets of Europe, European merchants had to get creative. How can we make clothes as cheaply and as well as Indians so our people will buy our clothes? So that's going to create competition to create innovation. Second, we also have European explorers bringing back Chinese luxury goods. And so there's plenty of European merchants and businessmen who are like, how can I create these really nice goods that I could then sell to more people than just the rich? Finally, innovation. There are a lot of important technologies that are developed in Europe that are going to give them a huge advantage in creating this factory system, mechanizing production, and thus producing things way faster than anyone else. We're going to mention a few that we have to know. First and most important is steam power. Roughly 1775 is when that's created. Steam power is important for two reasons. One, it creates a brand new energy source that is going to completely change how factories and transportations occur, or how production is done and how transportation happens. Steam is the process of when you use steam that comes from boiling water at an extremely high temperature to push levers or things in machines to make them go. This boiling point is reached by burning coal. So the use of coal as a new power source to create steam energy, steam power. Steam power is going to, change production. You can now have machines that are steam powered that can now move at a very fast rate and start creating goods much faster in a very consistent level than people who are making things by hand. So now you can have these factories. And you can build these factories as long as you have a coal source, somewhere you can get coal to power these factories. Second, it also changes transportation. Transportation is going to become much quicker and much cheaper because now you have trains that can run on coal power. You have steam power created by coal. You now have ships that also use coal and steam power. That is going to make it so people can travel more than ever before. It's also going to make it that you can trade farther and faster and move goods at a much larger rate. So overall, this is going to also increase trade and increase production. A few other innovations that are important. I kind of mentioned two of them: the steam-powered train, steam-powered ship for trade, transportation, things like that. There's also the spinning jenny. The spinning jenny is a way to create clothes faster in a more mechanized way that could far outpace anyone hand weaving anything. This creates the first real industry that Europe creates, which is the textile. The textile is the first and most important factory-based production. And the first factories are where just there's a bunch of spinning jennies in one room, people working those spinning jennies to produce clothes at a much, much faster rate and for much cheaper. Our last innovation is the telegraph. The telegraph allows for the first ever instant communication by Morse code, but still instant communication. My video.
Wow, that looks really bad. Can you even read that?
I spent a lot of time trying to write really neat, so that was really rude.
You like
why rewrite it if it's already there?
Oh no!
Always filming. So even though we just talked about how Europe was the first to industrialize, England was the first European country to industrialize. And then all the other European countries followed their lead. So we want to see, why did England specifically be the first to industrialize? Some advantages England had that other countries didn't. First, they went through an agricultural revolution. How do they do this? Well, first, England was one of the first countries that allowed their rich landlords to start buying out all the extra land. In every village, there's a land that's held in common that all the villagers share. These landowners were allowed to buy this land, so they had these huge estates. What they started doing is that they started growing food to sell. So not just enough for people to live on, but enough to sell and make money. This increased the amount of food that was produced, which increased population. At the same time, there was new agricultural techniques and technology that allowed people to grow food with less people. So what happens is that you have increased population with less than ever who need to actually be farmers. This creates a movable population that is willing to work for very cheap. This is the labor that European factory owners are going to use to work in their factories for very cheap. This means that instead of having to compete with farmers or could try to get people to come to the factories, they already have people who are desperate for work and willing to work for very, very little money. Second, geographic advantage. This means that England, where it's situated, is very, very helpful to them for two reasons. First, England has a lot of rivers, so it makes travel throughout England very cheap, very easy, and very quick. Second, England has a lot of coal.
Mika, quiet.
Good quiet. Good girl. Eat Mika. Thank you. England has a lot of coal, which allows it to, once remember, coal is the main thing you need for steam power. So it has a lot of coal deposits, which means it can have a lot of factories. It can have a lot of steam travel and things like that for very cheap. England's global empire also gave it a lot of advantages. England had some of the most colonies worldwide. And as an island, England also had a very powerful navy. So this navy made sure that they would be able to trade worldwide. It also made sure England had direct trade with Asian markets. And it also made sure that England could get a lot of raw resources from its colonies. This would provide the cheap goods for England to use in their factories and gave England a lot of places where they could sell their finished goods. Last but not least, England's business environment. England, for one, heavily favored businesses and innovators. What I mean by this is, one, England's lax religious laws meant a lot of different people of faiths lived in England, so there's a lot of people who can innovate. Two, they had very lax laws for business, so business owners could treat their workers really badly, which means that their goods could be cheaper and that they could that their goods could be a lot cheaper, competition-wise. Third, what we have is called patent laws, which basically means that if you come up with an item or an invention, then it's yours. No one else can steal it from you. You can make a lot of money off that. So that encourages people to invent more goods. And basically, what we're getting at is that it's really easy to own and run a business in England, which makes it more likely that people are willing to invest and put money into businesses, innovations, factories, things like that. Cool, we're going to pause here, and you're going to answer your third and final question. Go ahead and go.